There may be times when you need to convert numeric values given to you perhaps from another database by being imported, or perhaps someone has typed things in, as we have here, into separate columns, where we have the month in one column, the day in another, the year in another, hours, minutes and seconds all in separate columns. There may come a time when you need to convert that into a usable date to then manipulate in Excel, to then perhaps use some of our other date and time functions. Now, there are actually two ways of converting what effectively are just numeric values into date values and time values. Let's look at the dates first. The two functions are DateValue and date. Now, they work slightly differently. The date value requires you to obviously enter the function name and then provide a string that would read as a date, but Excel cannot see it as a date. So we're effectively having to convert that text string into a date. So for us to use it, we need to actually build the text string. So date value, open brackets. So our date will firstly be the month, then concatenate a slash. So we've seen concatenation in action. So it's ampersand, open speech marks, slash, open speech marks, ampersand, to then add on the day, then ampersand and add on another slash, and then ampersand to add on the year. So these three cells stuck together with slashes between them would form the date. But if we just tried to concatenate these three cells, Excel will just display as the result, which would be 2/23/12. If we then wanted to use that result in another formula, perhaps to work out how long ago that was, or the difference between that date and another date, then we're going to need to convert that text value into a date value, and we use that using DateValue. So when I press return, we'll see a date value. We know already that this is the raw number behind the actual date, and with a little bit of formatting, we can see what we were expecting, which is 2/23/12. Without the DateValue function, we would simply get a concatenated string that would say 2/23/12. Here we know it's recognizing it as a date because we get the 4 digits for the year. And I can then replicate this down the column, and it will do all the rest of that column as dates. Perfect for us to then go and use elsewhere. Now, an alternative to doing the same thing would be to use the date function, equals date, open brackets. Now, the date function works slightly differently in that you don't have to build a concatenated string. We simply need to pass it the three parts, but they have to be passed in the correct order. You can see here the parameters. It wants the year first, so the year is in that cell, then the month, so that's that cell, then the day. We don't need to build the string that will build the date and then be converted. We simply pass the three correct parameters. I get exactly the same value. And replication. However, you will spot that there is a difference between the dates here and the dates here. That difference is caused by the difference in the interpretation of a 2-digit year. Here we see the assumption of the 12 in the year is 1912, whereas the assumption here is 2012. With the date function, if you supply a 2-digit year, Excel adds 1900 to that year, and you'll see that in most cases that means we end up with 1900 dates. However, if I were to post a year here of 112, it would then change that into 2012, but our date value would not be able to calculate that as a year, because Excel cannot handle dates before 1900. The safest option for both these functions is to deal with solely 4-digit years, because if I put 2012 in there, both of these functions then work and both return the same result. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're using these two functions, that the date function, when dealing with a 2-digit year, will pretty much most of the time fall into 1900 and something, whereas our date value will use the Excel default assumption, which is based around the year 50. 50 and above, it will assume 1900. 49 and below, it will assume 2000. Both of these assumptions are different, and it is much safer to deal with 4-digit years the whole time. Here we would replace all of these dates, 4-digit years, and both of our functions would then return the result you would expect when dealing with them. Now, the reason that there are two functions is that there are potentially two different times when you'd want to use one or the other. The date function works well when you're supplying different cell values. So you may be getting the month from here, the day from there, the year from there. The date value works well when you already have the date calculated, so worked out through some potential concatenated string, but Excel is not seeing it as a date, so we force the conversion. And the same thing happens with our time functions. We have a time value function, which has to be built around a string. So we take hours, the normal date delimiter, which is the colon, and minutes, and the next delimiter, and the seconds. And that will return a time value, again, not formatted. So we would choose time, replicate, and they are now all converted to time. So 3:25 is 3:25 AM. Change one of these to higher than 12, and we get a PM time. Now the time function works a bit like the date function in that you simply provide the cells that hold the proportions, so the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. And you'll find that this time we don't have any assumption problems. The times returned by time are the same as those returned by the time value. So again, it's one doesn't require you to build the string. You simply select the components you require. The other requires you to build the string. This time a time string, so it requires the delimiter of colons. Personally, I find the date and the time functions really very useful when you're trying to increment values. So for example, if you started with a time element of 10 AM, and then you wanted to add on a time element to that, 10 o'clock, so we'll say equals that cell plus a time of no hours, 2 minutes, and no seconds, then it will add on 2 minutes for us, and we can then replicate that down the column and find that we get 2-minute intervals. So that's using the time function there, in this case, to add on a bit of time. Now you must provide a value for each of the 3 parameters. So if we don't want any hours, we explicitly have to put a 0, so it adds no hours on. We don't want any seconds, so we explicitly have to put a 0, so we don't want to add any seconds on. You cannot leave any of those parameters empty. They're not optional. So if you don't want to add an element in, we simply leave them as 0. And we could do the same with date if you wanted to add on parts of a date to another date. So these are 2 useful packets of functions, date value and date, time value and time, for converting either separate cell values or a concatenated string into a date or into a time.